Okay, so Rob, welcome back. We're ready for chapter 2 here. Don't you want to just give us like an overview of where we've been so far and then where you want to take us over the next couple of weeks?
Sure, Doug. I think when people see this raw video, the footage of this actual recording, what you've got to understand is this is a raw presentation of thoughts and concepts that we're putting down on paper. We believe there is some value to people seeing it off the bat, but ultimately this is going to be edited and refined and be presented in a more formal format, probably as a book. However, this being the second part of that, really to recap on the first part, the first discussion that we had was about carbohydrate addiction. And again, tonight, I'm going to use a piece of paper. I'm going to write on this, and this will be available together with the discussion. But the greatest challenge for people that have a weight or a diabetes problem, especially type 2 diabetes, is to transform their way of thinking away from this being a pure nutritional problem to really being a substance abuse or a carbohydrate addiction problem. And so that was kind of the discussion of the first chapter. However, once you understand that you do have an addiction, all addictions are treated through abstinence. And the problem with abstinence is while it removes the toxic drug from your environment, it also leaves a huge deficit. Every addiction out there, whether it's crystal meth, crack cocaine, gambling, smoking, alcohol, whatever it may be, is pretty much what I call a one-to-one transfer. In other words, the reason you use the substance is primarily, if not exclusively, for the emotional management function. Carbohydrates, on the other side, are much more sophisticated in that the reason they became prevalently available to us in the 60s and 70s, and when the government institutionalized carbohydrates as a so-called healthy form of eating, they filled a so-called food gap. And all the intentions were correct. All the intentions were to improve our quality of nutrition. But what the food pyramid people and what the government didn't understand at the time is that what they were actually doing was putting a highly neuroactive drug into our food system and making it freely available, and then actually telling people that it had very powerful, very positive nutritional benefits. And while we absolutely know, based on evidence right now, that there is nothing to support carbohydrates from an essential nutritional perspective, a large parts of our society still continue to cling onto the notion that eating carbohydrates and consuming foods associated with carbohydrates is a healthier way of eating and drinking. And what I'm going to talk about today is to look at, okay, if we remove carbohydrates from our environment, what are the deficits they leave and how do we replace that? And when you remove carbohydrates, unlike all other addictive substances and behaviors, they leave two large deficits. The first deficit that they leave is an emotion management system deficit. And that is going to be the subject of chapter 3. So I'm not going to discuss that right now. But they also leave a food deficit. And they leave a deficit in terms of what to eat, as well as how to eat that food. So it's a pattern of eating as well as a substance. And when you're eating for the endorphin aspect, the type of food that you eat and the pattern by which you eat is distinctly different, as we talked about in the last chapter, to eating and drinking for the nutritional value. So I'm going to go through some of the rationale behind a return to a nutritional format of eating and talk about what's essential in our diet, what human beings were designed evolutionarily and genetically to eat, and where some mistakes have been made in the past so that you can hopefully correct that as you improve your diet. And a large part of what I'm going to talk about today is going to clash very heavily with the pure nutritionists out there that are dealing with macros and micros. I think let's start with this concept. And the first concept is that of macros and micros. We love to use these words, macro and micro. What do they actually mean? And when I ask my patients, who are educated people, most people have no idea what that means. This is very, very simple. A macro, and I'm going to simplify it, a macro is primarily the fuel, the energy that our bodies need. And a macro for our bodies can come in three forms. It can come in the form of carbohydrates, sugars and starches, which is what carbohydrates are. Carbohydrates are a combination of sugar and starch. That's the category that is carbohydrates. It can come in the form of protein, and it can come in the form of fat. Those are the three macros that we have. Two of those are important to human survival. One has a survival advantage, but is not essential to life. The protein and fat have both a macro and a micro role to play. Carbohydrates are exclusively a macro. What the word micro means the substances we have to eat to maintain the function of our body. So these things don't give our bodies energy, but they help the body to function smoothly. And what are they? Those are the vitamins, the minerals, the trace elements, fiber, that type of thing that help the body to function. The way I look at the difference between macros and micros is this. If you drive a Prius, a car, a hybrid car, motor vehicles can run off gasoline, they can run off electricity, and they can run off diesel. Those things are the things that go in the gas tank or provide power to the car. That's the equivalent of the macros, carbohydrates, protein, and fat. What you put in the engine, the oil in the engine, the water in the radiator, the air in the tires, those do not make the car move, but they make the car run smoothly. That's the equivalent to the micros. And those are essential to the body, and macros, and micros can either come from animal organs, which most Americans are uncomfortable eating, and the other place that micros can come from is vegetables and salads. So those are the types of foods in various quantities that we should be eating to provide ourselves the micro components. From a macro perspective, if you look at your Prius, if you put diesel in a Prius's engine, what happens to the engine? It destroys the engine. And in exactly the same way, if you put carbohydrates in the human body, it destroys the engine. Priuses are designed primarily and optimally to run off electricity with gasoline as a backup. In exactly the same way, the human body is primarily designed to run off fat, with protein as a backup. It is counterintuitive to think that my muscles, which is the primary source of protein in our bodies, is our primary source of energy. And the fat that I carry is just there for blubber or for insulation. No, the fat is my primary source of energy. That's why I store it really well. And the protein is a backup source of energy. But primarily protein, and this is a critically important distinction from the world out there, protein is primarily a micronutrient. Protein is a micronutrient. The primary role of protein is for tissue repair, tissue building, as a hormone, as an enzyme. And I'll come back to a macro role for protein, but that is a critical mistake that the new nutritionists, the nouveau nutritionists have made that is counter-evolutionary. Protein is not a primary fuel source. It is a backup fuel source. Fat is your primary fuel source. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but I just wanted to explain macros and micros. So let's get back to the original story. In the current modern American diet, which is the SAD diet, the standard American diet, or the food pyramid, when you eat carbohydrates, and here is a distinction from the world out there, it doesn't matter how the carbohydrates go in your face. I don't care what format it takes. I don't care what it's associated with. Irrespective of how carbohydrates go in your face, the intestine will turn it to glucose. It's actually glucose, fructose, and galactose, but for the sake to simplify this discussion, let's call it glucose. Glucose is a six-sided carbon molecule for the chemists, and it doesn't matter what the source is. It doesn't matter if it's ice cream or an apple. In fact, an apple has slightly more sugar in it than a bowl of ice cream. And the world out there will make the distinction between apples are healthy and ice creams are not. In other words, they quantify the health category of a food substance based on the association with the carbohydrates, not on the carbohydrates themselves. I don't care how healthy a glass of red wine is. If you're an alcoholic, all alcohol is bad, no matter whether a glass of red wine has antioxidants in it or not. So if you're obese, if you're diabetic, the source of the carbohydrates are irrelevant. It's the carbohydrates themselves that are the problem. And when you consume those carbohydrates, what goes into your bloodstream is glucose. So again, to use another analogy, it doesn't matter if it's a Marlboro unfiltered, a Camel Light, vape, or chewing tobacco. It's nicotine that enters your bloodstream, and that's the addictive substance. So when you eat a carbohydrate, glucose goes into your body, and glucose stimulates the pancreas to produce insulin. Insulin's job is to get the sugar that occurs in your bloodstream removed from the bloodstream. And the primary places that insulin moves sugar, it moves it into the liver, and it moves it into your muscles. And for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to talk about the relationship between insulin and the liver, because the liver then takes that sugar and converts it to fat and ships it out to the fat cells where it is stored. Okay? So when you eat a carbohydrate load, your blood sugar spikes up. And what happens is your insulin level spikes up, and spikes are never biologically good. But what the insulin does is it drives your blood sugar down. And when your blood sugar goes down, you get hungry. And what do you do when you're hungry? You eat. So throughout the day, you're eating, getting hungry. And the nouveau nutritional world has actually adapted its messaging on how often you should be eating to accommodate for the spike and fall of your blood sugar. And they recommend eating 6 to 8 small meals a day, most commonly, not because that's biologically necessary, but because that accommodates to the pattern of what's happening in your bloodstream when it comes to the consumption of sugar. And the way that I look at sugar is, if you're going to make a fire, you can use wood or you can use coal. If wood is the equivalent of glucose or sugar, and coal is the equivalent of fat, then if you're making a fire with wood, the wood burns very quickly. It flames up and then it burns out. And you have to keep adding wood to the fire to keep the fire going. On the other hand, coal, or the equivalent of fat, you need a small amount of coal, you light it on fire, it's slow to burn, but a small amount of coal just smolders and produces heat for a prolonged period of time, and you do not have to keep adding coal to the fire. So if you think about a fire in terms of burning glucose is the equivalent of wood that you have to keep adding, fat is the equivalent of coal that you add once or twice a day, and you can keep the fire burning forever. So I'll come back to that analogy in a little bit, but what happens when you're eating glucose is continuously your blood sugar is rising and falling, and insulin is going up and down, and insulin is forcing that sugar out of the bloodstream into the liver, and the liver is turning it into fat. So the liver is the place where fat is produced when you eat carbohydrates. What you should be doing is storing fat during and after a meal, and then using that fat as part of your energy system. But when you're eating continuously, there's no ebb and flow. There's just the tide is only going one way, and you're accumulating. You're not storing fat now. You're actually accumulating more and more fat. And as you accumulate that fat and you don't use it, obviously your weight increases, you become obese over time. The key thing about the way the human body works is it should work ideally in an ebb and flow pattern. So what you should do, as I said, is eat a meal, use some of that sugar, store some of it, and then between meals, use that fat. And when fat gets broken down, the energy unit of fat is called ketones, and you should be able to break your fat down to ketones. The problem is that insulin, one of the very first effects of insulin, is to block the conversion of fat to ketones. It's pretty intuitive. Your body doesn't want sugar as well as ketones as two separate sources of fuel. In your Prius, you're not going to use electricity at the same time that you're using gasoline. You're going to use one or the other. And that's exactly the same way that the human body works, with insulin being the regulator of whether you use ketones or glucose. The problem is that if you're eating little snacks and little meals continuously throughout the day, your insulin level is continuously up. You don't have the capacity to burn that fat. You cannot get yourself into ketosis. You could only really get into what I call internal ketosis, where you're burning your own fat, if your insulin levels are low. So even in a healthy person, if they're eating continuously, you can't do that. Now, the human body is designed to eat once or twice a day. Okay, so remember that analogy where we talked about wood, which is the glucose. When you're eating fat, fat is like coal. So you eat a little bit of fat, your blood sugar may transiently go up, but then for a long period of time, you're burning that fat and you stay in ketosis, which is where you're burning fat, and then maybe you eat a second meal down the road. So you're eating 2 meals, let's call this lunch and dinner, you're eating 2 meals in a day, but what happens during these meals is your insulin level is very low because you're burning fat. You do not need insulin to burn fat. Then during the meal, you might see not a spike, but a rise in your insulin for 1 to 2 hours. And then your insulin drops down to a basal level. And for a long period of time, your insulin is low until you eat again, it rises up a little bit, and then it goes to basal for 1 to 2 hours. So it may be at most with a low carbohydrate meal that your blood sugar rises a little bit for 1 to 2 hours, about 4 hours a day, which means that for 20 plus hours a day, you should be in a state of ketosis. And the value of ketosis is how can you only eat once or twice a day? Well, ketosis suppresses appetite. So you don't feel hungry. And if you don't feel hungry, you're not eating, if you can manage it that way. And that is why burning coal, which is the equivalent of fat, and it just keeps on burning for a long period of time, reduces the need to eat. So while you feel satisfied with these 2 meals, you undereat because you're not eating 6 to 8 times a day, and that is how you reduce calories. Not intentionally through some diet that is calorie restrictive, but you use the natural feedback pathways of the body that suppresses appetite through ketosis to eat less and to eat less often. Because what happens is when you are eating fat as a fuel source, the fat activates the release of a hormone called leptin from the fat cells, and leptin is your satiety hormone. Glucose has no leptin function, 0 leptin function. And that is why you can keep on eating repetitively and you don't feel full, and you can keep on eating sugar. You can have a big steak and feel full from the steak. 2 minutes later, you're not eating more steak, but you are eating ice cream or chocolates or chips. You're eating a carbohydrate because that is not under the influence of leptin regulation. Whereas if you're eating that steak and you stop there, you're full, and you're full for a long period of time right here because of that leptin activation. So what we want to do in our diet is utilize the traditional or genetic or historical evolutionary feedback mechanisms of the body to control and regulate how much we're actually eating and how often we're eating. And in that way, we reduce our caloric consumption. And guess what we do? We lose weight. So understanding that balance, understanding that difference is critically important. But there's another even more compelling reason to change your diet to be predominantly fat-based in terms of your macro or your calorie source rather than sugar-based. And here's what it is. The way the liver works is when you are eating meals once or twice a day, like you do when you're eating fat, the liver for long periods of time does not see significant amounts of insulin. Your insulin level when you're not eating drops to a very, very low level. And in fact, the liver becomes a producer of sugar. Well, when the liver is producing sugar to maintain your blood sugar, your insulin level is very low, which means that your liver remains very insulin sensitive. And therefore, a small change in insulin, when you expose that to food, causes a massive uptake of energy from the bloodstream where the liver converts that to fat. Now, remember what the liver is going to do after each meal is it's going to store a little bit of the energy as sugar in the form of glycogen. And once the glycogen stores, which last about 10 or 15 minutes, once they're full, as that emergency need, as that little burst of nitrous from your liver, the rest gets converted to fat and stored as fat. When you're eating a carbohydrate-rich meal and your blood sugar is spiking and dropping all the time, the liver is continuously exposed to insulin. And guess what? The liver does over time. It just says, screw that. I'm not going to respond to insulin anymore. The stuff's around all the time. Why should I be sensitive to insulin? And slowly the liver becomes more and more resistant we call that insulin resistant, more and more resistant to the effects of small changes in insulin. So now your pancreas, when you eat a carbohydrate load, has to produce a much larger amount of insulin to get the same extraction of energy from the bloodstream and conversion to fat. Every human being genetically has an upper limit of insulin production, and that's genetically defined. So for example, as a population, the East Indians have a very, very low peak insulin production capacity. Other people have a very, very high peak insulin production capacity. And what's interesting is that the fattest people in the world have the highest insulin production capacity. Why? Because you can't become enormous if you can't produce insulin. So what happens is, at some stage, when they eat enough carbohydrates and they become resistant to this insulin because of that continuous exposure, everybody reaches a peak production capacity of insulin. And during that insulin resistance phase, slowly the blood sugar rises because the liver is more sluggish at removing that sugar from the bloodstream. So your body becomes tolerant or accepts a slightly higher blood sugar. Now that's not a good thing because it's damaging the blood vessels of the blood cells, and I'm going to talk about that in the second part of this. However, what happens is your blood sugar rises a little bit. It could still be normal. Remember, normal blood sugar is around 70 to 80 when people are fasting. But under the condition, and that's under the conditions of insulin sensitivity. But under conditions of insulin resistance, the human body accepts fasting blood sugars of 90, 100, 110, borderline high. Now, damage is happening, but the liver is sluggish to react. It doesn't absolutely correct your blood sugar. And eventually you reach a peak insulin production capacity. And if the liver is still sluggish to react to that, now you eat a carbohydrate load and the liver does not remove it from the bloodstream. So what happens is your blood sugar starts going up and you don't have enough insulin to remove that sugar from the bloodstream. Guess what that disease is called? That disease is called diabetes mellitus, type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is where the liver does not react to the chronic excessive consumption of carbohydrates in the bloodstream. Then your blood sugar goes up, it starts to damage certain cells, and in particular, it damages the red blood cells that are in the bloodstream, and it attaches to the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, and it creates that glycosylation of the red blood cells, creates a molecule called hemoglobin A1C. And that is our measure of diabetes. So that's how diabetes occurs. But the damage to your body occurs at this interface. And it occurs not because of the amount of carbohydrate we eat at any one meal, but because of the persistent consumption of carbohydrates, irrespective of the source. And it is this diabetes, this effect, this insulin resistance diabetes effect, that creates a disease complex called CMOD, which is the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity and diabetes. And there they are. If you can produce a lot of insulin, you become fat before you become diabetic. If you cannot produce, if you're genetically, your pancreas can't produce a lot of insulin, you become diabetic before you become very fat. Same problem, two slightly different pathways based upon your genetic capacity to produce insulin. However, if you do not eat carbohydrates, it is impossible. If you do not eat carbohydrates, it is impossible to have type 2 diabetes. And the way we get type 2 diabetics to get into remission is by removing carbohydrates from their diet, restoring a kind of coal burning effect rather than a wood burning effect, and slowly their insulin sensitivity returns and your type 2 diabetes goes away. You may have a minor amount of insulin resistance, but all those illnesses that are diabetogenic improve or go away. And that is a critical aspect. Not only do you lose weight, but you also, your risk of dying, your risk of cancer, your risk of heart attacks, of strokes, all those things that we've blamed fat for such a long time, get better and go away. Now, if you look at this pattern of eating, not only have we talked about why the constant consumption of glucose is bad, and why fat is of value, if you look at what I've called the coal burning effect, what does this look like? You're eating twice a day. Well, there's some new sexy phenomenon out there that we've suddenly just discovered, and it's become this new hot topic. What's it called? It's called intermittent fasting. Oh, it's this hot new topic. Well, how hot is it? How new is it? Intermittent fasting means eating once or twice a day and going long periods of time between meals. Guess what? We've been doing that for a couple of 100,000 years. And if you look at this diagram over here, this is the diagram of intermittent fasting. Basically, what IF means, if you're going to follow what's called a 16-8 or a 23-1 pattern, it means that you do all of your eating in an 8-hour window. And the intermittent fasting people, the sudden discovery, focus mostly on the period of time where you actually eat. I would argue the other way around. I would say, why don't you focus on the 16 plus hours where you are not consuming any calories? In other words, the period of time that you're actually using the fat that you've stored. And if during the 16-hour period, you're using the fat that you've stored and you use a slight excess of stored fat, you are now losing weight. But even for skinny, normal people, that ebb and flow allows you to store fat rather than accumulate fat. This pattern over here results in fat accumulation. This pattern allows in temporary fat storage and utilization between stores. So this 16 hours is the most important aspect for me. And in fact, the way that this works is that if you eat your 2 meals in the 8 hours, for approximately 4 to 6 hours after a meal, you're using up the energy that is stored in the liver. So remember what I said, the first thing the body does, or the liver does, right when it starts sucking up energy out of the bloodstream, is it first makes glycogen. And in the 4 to 6 hours here, the liver uses glycogen and the muscles use it as well, and they deplete your glycogen stores, not completely, but to a very low rate. And there comes a point where the liver says, hey, I've used up my excess glycogen, I now need to find an alternative source of food. So either you eat, which we don't want you to do during this time, and if you're in ketosis, you're not hungry, so the biologic incentive is not there. And if you don't eat, the liver has to go to your fat stores because your insulin is low. The liver goes to your fat stores, and then for a prolonged period of time over here, for that maybe 10 to 12 hours, guess what you're burning? You're burning fat. And that's the whole principle behind intermittent fasting. And the longer you can make this period of time, the more fat you burn. On a day like today, where I was at work the whole day, I came home this evening, came home about 7 o'clock, and I had a meal. So I've eaten once. So I'm in a 23-1. So what I've done is I didn't do that. I've had my one meal over here, and I've gone 23 hours where I've actually utilized my fat stores. Now, I haven't died of anorexia today because my body won't allow me to do that. But I used up my energy from my liver very quickly, and I'll do that, and probably around 1, 2 o'clock tonight, I'll convert to be in ketosis. And one of the reasons why that's critically important is because if you're eating this way, guess what? When you wake up in the morning, not hungry. So why the hell eat breakfast if you're not hungry? Okay? The concept that breakfast is the most important meal of the day and kickstart your metabolism, those concepts did not come from God or nature. They came from 2 very smart people. One of them was a doctor, the Kellogg's brothers, who discovered cornflakes in the late 1800s. And they created kickstart your metabolism, most important meal of the day, as advertising or marketing slogans to sell cornflakes. Prior to that, the majority of people did not wake up in the morning and suddenly eat. We went out onto the fields, we worked, we might have had something to drink in the morning, and when we came back from the fields, we had high tea in England and Europe. The Eskimos went out and did their thing and came back and ate in the middle of the day. Almost all the first world people eat much later in the day. Nobody that is eating genetically or evolutionarily eats breakfast. We go a long period of time. Why? Because we're in ketosis, and when we're in ketosis, because of leptin, we're not hungry. Why the hell eat when you're not hungry? But we start our day with breakfast, we start our day with cereal, an orange juice, or a Pop-Tart, which means we've got a spike in our sugar, and we continue that way the whole day. How the hell can you not be fat and sick if that's the pattern? So we want to let go of breakfast, get rid of breakfast, and see how deep into the day you can go before you actually need to eat. And that might be lunch, but it might also just be dinner. The timing of a meal is irrelevant. The deeper into the day you can go, the better. And what we look for is to make eating a meal event. It is an event where you prepare food, you sit down with a knife and fork and a plate of food, and you eat. And it doesn't matter what animal you are in terms of the carnivorous side, animals that eat fat as a primary fuel source, they sit down or they rest and they eat. The lion eats after it's caught a piece of game. The only ones that graze continuously are the vegetarians because they don't eat any fat. So the goal is to create eating events. What does the modern American do? We snack all day long. We're sitting at our desk and working. We've got a bowl of chips or the M&Ms, or maybe we're doing keto food, so we're eating some cheese, some nuts, and some pepperoni. It doesn't matter what the quality of the food is. A snack is always an emotional event. A snack is almost always an emotional event. It is never a nutritional event. So we're eating for our heads. We're consuming calories for our heads. So a snack is calories for our brain. Not our brain function, but for our emotional management. So I coined a term. I use a term called a bridge because I understand as a fat guy that I need to put something in my mouth. No matter what I say, what I think about calories and nutrition, I need something in my face, whether it's a piece of gum or something like that, to manage my emotional needs. But it shouldn't have calories. So a bridge is something that you consume that has no calories that you eat for what I call your head hunger. That little stressful need to eat, that need to have a cigarette break or to have a little snack. So a bridge is a snack that doesn't contain calories. And the bridge that I use in my own life is a cup of coffee. There's always in my life a cup of coffee in it. It's either black or got a little bit of whole milk in it, but I'm consuming that throughout the day because it contains no calories throughout the day as a way to get me across a moment where I need to put something in my face for my emotions, but I don't want to make it a meal. And if you do that, you get rid of this pattern, you can maintain your 1 or 2 meals a day and yet satisfy the endorphin needs by putting something in your face. Now, that could be some water, it could be something with crystal light. As long as it doesn't contain calories, we want you to develop a bridge in your life so that you've got access to something you can eat and drink that does not cause you caloric harm. And so it's not just the act of eating sugar, it's the context in which we eat, which is eating once or twice a day and going long periods of time where we're not eating to allow our livers to recover. Now, let's get back to the world out there and misinformation. 70 years ago, as we said in the first part, the world turned against fat. We believed that fat, when we ate it, was clogging our arteries and causing all kinds of harm to our bodies. And Ansel Keys and a group of others created the lipid heart hypothesis. So we became lipophobic. Oh my God, you can't eat fat. If you look at a piece of bacon, you're going to die of a heart attack. So as people understood that carbohydrates, and they say, oh, simple sugars, it's the bad sugars, there's healthy, there's a medical word for that. That's bullshit. Because remember what I said, it doesn't matter how it goes in your mouth. Whether it's honey or an apple or ice cream or a Coke, sugar is sugar. Okay, so the first thing there is there's no such thing as natural sugar or healthy sugar. Sugar is sugar. Doesn't matter how it goes in your face. And the example I use with my adolescents is this. If you've got a dog, would you eat your dog's poop? Hell no, I wouldn't eat my dog's poop. Well, what happens if I took your dog's poop and I made it smell nice and taste really good and I make it a pretty color? Would you eat it? No, poop is poop. I don't care how you camouflage it. Shit is shit. And exactly the same when it comes to carbohydrates for fat people and diabetics. No matter how you camouflage the sugar, whether it's a starch, whether it's quinoa, whether it's grains, it doesn't matter how you camouflage it. Carbohydrates are carbohydrates, and they cause obesity and diabetes in vulnerable people. So that's the first thing to understand. But when you look at the lipid heart hypothesis, once you realize, ooh, these sugars are bad for me, but The fat is bad for me because it's going to give me a heart attack. Well, what's left? When you go to our macro list over here, you've got carbohydrates, protein, and fat. So the world out there who understands that you want to reduce your carbohydrate consumption, even the nouveau nutritionists, these sexy believers in what they believe to be healthy nutrition, push lean protein. Oh, you've got to eat your lean protein, whether it comes from a plant-based, and you get all these people pushing beans and all kinds of plant products and telling us that the plant protein is the same as the animal protein, which it is not. But irrespective, they push protein, protein, protein. You got to eat the egg white. You got to eat the tuna. You got to eat the fillet. Don't eat the fat. Cut the fat out. And the modern American diet has become devoid of fat. So we push protein. And they believe that protein is the essential macronutrient. We are designed to eat protein for our energy. Well, that is absolutely wrong. And here's why it's wrong. When you use protein as a fuel source, what does the liver do to protein to create energy out of it? It converts it to sugar by a process called gluconeogenesis. Remember what I said earlier on is that protein should primarily be a nutrient. It is there for tissue repair, tissue building, as a hormone, as an enzyme. That is the primary function of protein. It is a micronutrient. It is absolutely true that the reason why you don't have to eat carbohydrates and yet you still need sugar in your bloodstream is because the liver will take a small amount of protein and convert it to sugar to maintain a very low amount of blood sugar. If you took my body right now, and I am in ketosis right now, if you took my body and you melted me down and you extracted the sugar from my body, how much sugar do you think there is in my body? Take a guess. Teaspoon, tablespoon, cupful, gallon. How much sugar is in there in my body to maintain my blood sugar and keep me alive? Well, the reality is, the answer is, it's about 1 level teaspoon. It's about 5 grams. Think about how little that is in terms of protein. That's enough protein to maintain my blood sugar when I'm not consuming any carbohydrates. It's a pathetically small amount. So this whole thing, we have to eat protein. You've got to eat protein, protein, protein. It's macro. Again, I'm going to use my medical word. It is absolute bullshit. We focus way excessively on protein. Protein is essential in our diet, but in very, very small amounts. Unless you are a professional athlete or a distance runner or a trainer who's using up their muscles and damaging their muscles, you need very, very little protein. And anytime you eat fat from an animal product, protein always comes along for the ride. But if you want to prevent protein, the lean protein, that filet and that egg white, all going to sugar and not going to nutrition, you have to protect your protein by eating fat. So if you eat a ribeye steak, if you eat some bacon, if you eat dark meat to the chicken with a skin, if you eat a salmon, if you eat the high-fat products, a lamb chop with a big piece of fat on it, then the protein goes down the nutrition arm and the fat becomes your fuel source. If you eat the egg white, if you eat the tuna, that protein is just going straight down the sugar pathway, and it is not benefiting you either from a micronutrient perspective or a weight health perspective. So it's critically important to understand the true role of protein. And when I first started doing this way back, I clearly knew the damage of carbohydrates, but I bought into the low-fat, high-protein diet, and my patients didn't do so well. And it's only once we started going HF, high-fat, that we started protecting the protein and seeing these positive results. Remember, as a surgeon, we radically reduce, when we do bariatric surgery, the amount of food anybody can eat. And even when they're eating no carbohydrates, but they're eating a high lean protein diet, they still lose a ton of lean muscle. Because they don't have, even though they're burning fat, they're not able to utilize that fat to the extent to protect their protein. It is only when they eat a high-fat diet that they don't use that they don't lose that lean muscle mass. So it is critically important as you lose weight, as you convert yourself, that you eat a high-fat diet to protect your own muscles and to protect the protein that you are eating. Now, having said that, no matter what I tell you you should be eating, in the modern American diet, it is very, very difficult to find adequate sources of fat. Even milk in this country is called whole milk. It isn't called full cream milk. Where I come from in South Africa, we take milk from the cow, pasteurize it, and call it whole milk. It's still got all the fat in. In this country, we actually, even for whole milk, it's not full cream. We take some of the fat out. So it's very, very difficult to find adequate amounts of fat in a regular store. So while I want you to be able to select food based on its fat content, we also want you to do something else, and that is transition away from using sugar-based condiments to using what I call fat condiments, or do something that we call fat fortifying. So if you're going to have a micro meal, a micronutrient meal, let's say you're going to have a salad, or let's say you're going to have a bowl of vegetables, there's not a lot of fat in that. So the way you do that is you fat fortify. You add cheese, you add avocados, you may add some egg, you add olive oil. If I'm cooking vegetables, I'm going to add butter. I'm going to add mayo and make chicken salad, egg salad, tuna salad to increase the fat content of my meals. So while it's good to eat food that has a high fat content, it is absolutely essential in America and elsewhere in the world to fat fortify and have those condiments available and add them to foods to increase the fat content of regular meals. The other value of these soluble sources of fat is they're a very powerful activator of leptin, and then guess what? You eat a lot less when you feel full early. Okay, so let's go on to the two other aspects that are essential to changing how we eat. Carbohydrates, as I said, have absolutely no feedback in terms of when to stop. They have no satiety feedback. So what we've learned to do as a population is eat with our heads and our eyes. If you haven't eaten for a while, you dish up a massive amount of food because your brain says, ooh, I need this amount of food. And we put that food in front of us and we start eating, and we might feel a little bit full when our stomach gets full, but we look down and we say, I'll just finish the food. And we override some of the early satiety sensations, which are the stretch receptors, because we haven't activated leptin, and we way overeat, even if the food that we're eating is not massive amounts of carbohydrate. So we have to relearn to feel when to stop. And our brain is going to clash with our stomach. So the way to regulate how much you eat and yet not feel hungry, be satisfied, is to do what I call eating sequentially. And what does eating sequentially mean? It's a little bit artificial, but remember what I said, a meal is exclusively sitting at a table with a plate of food and a knife and fork. If you do not have the ability or the time, I'm too busy, guess what? You're not going to die of anorexia if you skip a meal. So if you're too busy to sit down with a plate of food and a knife and fork, like I was at lunchtime today, push through and eat dinner. You will not die of anorexia if you skip that meal. The body won't allow it. Okay? So, but when you are hungry, and I've only eaten one meal a day, I've got to eat a lot of food, my body, guess what? You dish up this massive amount of food. That's fine. Dish up what you think you need, but take that food and put it in the middle of the table. Get a tiny little plate, maybe a saucer or a small plate, and take a small amount of that food and put it into that plate. Dish up a tiny amount and put it in the middle of the plate. The best way to start is just testing yourself and use a saucer, and that little hole in the middle where the teacup goes, that's what you fill with food. So if you're going to eat an egg, cut the egg in half or cut the egg in 4 pieces and eat 1 piece. Eat that, and then ask yourself, how do I feel? Oh, I'm still hungry. Go back for more. I don't care how often you go back for more. But when you keep going back for more, that is a conscious decision. Yes, I'm still hungry. I need more. Whereas eating the food that's right in front of you, you know what? I'll override this and I'll eat that extra bit. At some point, when you're eating sequentially, you reach a point where you say, wow, you know what? I'm full. And if you're full, my plate's empty, you stop, and the rest of the food that's in the middle of the table goes back in the fridge. So you eat way less automatically from a caloric perspective, and you start reconnecting the signals from your stomach with your brain so that you stop eating when your stomach is full, not when your brain says you've had enough. The other aspect is if you're eating either the fat-fortified condiments or you're eating fat, early on in the meal it activates leptin, but leptin is a hormone. What that means is leptin goes from the fat cells through the bloodstream to your brain. It takes time. So it takes 5 or 10 minutes for leptin to begin to become active, and then slowly the power increases where you get that queasiness from the fat. That tells you that you're full. So if you're eating sequentially, you're eating slowly, you're deciding each bite whether you need another one. And if you, instead of, for example, if I'm going to eat a salad, put the dressing on the big salad in the middle of the table, you create the salad, you take a small amount onto your plate, and you put your olive oil and your cheese on that small amount, you're activating leptin much earlier in the meal. And therefore, that satiety signal is much more powerful, much earlier, and you end up being satisfied, which is the crucial part, being satisfied much earlier into meal. You're eating less, guess what? That's caloric reduction. You're eating less often, that's caloric reduction as well. And guess what you're doing? You're losing weight without counting calories, without creating a sense of starvation. Eating sequentially when you're out, what I tell people, what the restaurants do, the psychology of a restaurant, you walk in hungry, they give you the menu, you know they're going to take the menu away very quickly. So you order the starter, you order the entree, you over-order, and they take the menu away. Now you're stuck with too much food. What do? You overeat, or you take some home with you, or you waste the food. Eating sequentially in a restaurant means this. If you're eating by yourself, order a starter. Make sure that you modify the starter to get rid of the carbohydrates. Take the croutons out of the Caesar salad. Make sure that there's no carbohydrate on there. But order the starter, and when the waiter comes to take your order, oh man, sorry, I was on the phone, I was talking to my friends. Let me keep the menu. Bring me my starter. Let me keep my menu, and I'm going to decide after you bring my starter what else I want. I can assure you that the restaurant is very unlikely to run out of food while you're sitting there. So what you do is you eat that starter, but you've kept the menu. Now you've kept all your options open. Wow, you know what? I'm full. I need another one of the same starter. I need a different starter. I need an entree. I'm going to eat some leftovers. You've kept all those options open, but now you can eat to the point where your stomach says you're full, rather than your brain deciding how much you need preemptively and over-ordering. And in that way, again, you reduce your total caloric consumption. Even if you finish all the food, you needed that amount of food. But most often, you eat way less when you eat sequentially. So that is a critical pattern of eating. The final piece that we want to introduce in the change to eating and utilizing food. Remember, we talked about the ebb and flow, and up top here, we talked about eating, storing some glycogen in the liver, waiting for the liver to empty, and then burning fat. Well, what can I do to accelerate the rate of glycogen utilization? And the final one of these foursomes is frequent physical activity. Now, I know as soon as I wrote that, most fat people say, oh my God, no, I can't, my legs, my back, my butt. I'm talking about physical activity, not exercise, people. What you do is you fool your liver to think you're about to do work. So for example, if you're in a parking lot, park your car a little further away than right at the front door in the handicapped parking lot. And if you park that extra little further distance away, your liver doesn't know if you're going to take a 1-minute walk or go run a marathon, it preemptively releases glycogen in your bloodstream. So in the mornings, I ritualize, I make my bed, I take my dog for a walk, I park a little further away. When I'm at a store, I carry the basket if I can instead of pushing the cart. I'll take a set of stairs instead of an elevator. At the airport, I'll carry my bag instead of rolling it along. There are continuously throughout the day opportunities to do little bits of physical activity. And the value of this physical activity has two parts to it. The first one, it accelerates emptying your liver, so that you shorten this period of time where you're not burning fat, but you're burning glycogen. And instead of being 4 to 6 hours, you can reduce that to 1 to 2 hours, and that increases the amount of fat that you're burning. The second value of frequent physical activity, if your brain is trolling continuously for little moments to do physical activity, guess what it's not trolling for? It's not trolling for snacking. So there is a very powerful endorphin effect of doing those little things. And if you're thinking continuously about little bits of physical activity, your brain isn't thinking about snacking. So if I've got my cup of coffee that I sip on over here, and I've got my little bits of physical activity, I'm taking care of my minor endorphin and emotional needs, and I'm not using eating and drinking of calories to satisfy that need. And we're gonna embrace and talk a lot more about frequent physical activity. So, having said all of this, how does all of this work? And on the flip side of this, and you'll get a sheet in front of you, is the algorithm that I want you to use to convert your way of eating to an LCHF or a ketogenic way of life. And you'll see up here at the top of the sheet of paper, it says LCHF, ketogenic, Banting, paleo, New Atkins. Those are all diets. And while I like the fact that they are low carbohydrate, high fat diets, I dislike the fact that they have the word diet associated with them. These are eating patterns, but the value of writing those up top there is because that's where you can go to get ideas and suggestions of what you can eat. However, the way we want you to do it is this. Number one, don't eat or drink anything unless you are absolutely certain about the total carbohydrate content of the food you're eating. Most of the time it's in the box on the back, and ignore net carbs and ignore sugars and sugar alcohols and all the other mumbo jumbo that they use to market stuff to you. Your body does not do that kind of mental gymnastic mathematics. Just look at one number, the total carbohydrate number. And if that's elevated, stay the hell away from that food or that drink. The goal is zero. The goal is zero. The goal is no carbohydrates. Any addiction is managed through abstinence. So the goal is zero carbs. But I can't do that. Of course you can't do that, because certain foods have an incidental amount of carbohydrates. So if I put a little bit of whole milk or cream in my coffee, there is 2 grams of carbohydrates in the milk I put in my coffee. Well, guess what? That counts toward my 30 grams. So we sanction up to 30 grams of total carbohydrates per day as the maximum amount of incidentals that you're allowed to eat. That does not, and the reason I started by emphasizing the zero, because as opposed to diets all have in a built-in allowance so that you're allowed to have a little bit each day. You can have that piece of chocolate at the end of the night. Well, guess what? Addicts can't just have a little piece of chocolate. I defy you to have one chip out of the bag, one block of chocolate at night. I defy you to have one scoop of ice cream. So the goal of addiction management is zero, but we use the 30 grams to stay under 30 grams to account for incidentals. But anything that you eat counts toward the 30. So for example, I had a guy that was eating ribs. Ribs, animal products, have zero carbohydrates. So he was eating his ribs and he didn't understand why he wasn't doing well and getting into ketosis, because there was 90 grams on average of sugar in the sauce and the rub he was putting on the ribs. So please make sure you know your incidentals and use that to calculate toward the 30, but it's not permission, if you've only eaten 5 the whole day, to go and eat a chocolate chip cookie or half a banana to bring it up to 30. This is not an allowance, okay? The second thing is we do not count vegetables. We do not count vegetable carbohydrates. Why? Because the whole point about that is against a plant-based diet from a macro perspective is because the human body has lost evolutionarily the capacity to extract a significant amount of energy from vegetable materials. So if you look at 20 grams of vegetables, less than 5% of that is, on typically the leafy green vegetables, is bioabsorbable. You poop that all out. Cows and gorillas, herbivores, have bacteria in their stomachs and in their colons that extract that sugar from the plant material, and actually no animal, no mammal healthily consumes carbohydrates into their bloodstream. Even cows that consume a lot of cellulose, which is a type of sugar, do not absorb the sugar into their bloodstream. What the bacteria in the intestine do is convert the sugar to fatty acids. So what does a cow eat? What does a gorilla eat? They eat cellulose, and then the bacteria convert it to fat, and they are actually absorbing fat into their bloodstream exactly like what I'm asking you to do. The only difference is we kind of use the cow as the factory for that fat, and then we should be eating the cow. So understand that no mammal is immune to diabetes or obesity if it eats carbohydrates. That's why we fatten up cows in feedlots by feeding them pure carbohydrates, pure starches. That's why we can fatten a goose's liver and create a fatty liver called foie gras. We don't feed them food, we feed them a drug called carbohydrates. So that's beside the point. But vegetables do not count, and vegetables are an important source of micronutrients for Americans who are uncomfortable eating the organs of animals. So if you want to do the nose to tail and eat the liver and the bone marrow and the tripe, absolutely, those are the best places to get your micronutrients from. And in fact, one of the healthiest things you can eat is liver. But when I tell my patients that, especially in this country, they're like, that's disgusting. So I'm not going to ask you to do something you're never going to do, but at least eat some vegetables to get your micronutrients in. So the goal is that all vegetables are free. All vegetables are free, but zero rice or potatoes. I don't care if it's a baked potato, brown rice, white rice. I don't care if it's French fries, zero rice or potatoes. And the reason for that is not from the nutritional people. It's from the addiction people. I've never met somebody who had a rough day and rushed to the fridge for the broccoli. But almost every fat person out there, when they've had a rough day, are reaching for the rice, reaching for the potatoes, whether it's potato chips, French fries, whatever that may be. And we will do these to excess for our emotional needs. Nobody does leafy green vegetables for their emotional needs. And eating the leafy green vegetables will keep you in ketosis because you don't absorb that the sugar from that. So that's an important aspect, okay? Remember that lean protein becomes sugar and blocks fat use. It causes an elevation of insulin. So always protect your lean protein with what I call my 5 fat friends: my butter, my olive oil, my coconut oil, my mayo, my heavy cream, my cheese, my eggs, my avocados. One of the most challenging things about this is to stay away from fruit. The only 2 fruits that we allow is avocados and occasionally tomatoes. Even though tomatoes have a fairly high carbohydrate level, those are the 2 that we allow, no other fruit. And I actually, as opposed to some of the keto dietary purists, I tell my patients to avoid the berries. Okay? People, oh, blueberries, strawberries, they have a low glycemic index, they have a low carbohydrate content, they're okay on a keto diet. Here's the problem with berries. If there's a punnet of blueberries in my fridge, I'm doing drive-bys all day long until they're gone. So I can't control my relationship with strawberries and blueberries. So the issue is not that a strawberry or a blueberry is bad, it's the concept of snacking. Exactly the same applies to nuts. Nuts are absolutely fine, particularly non-peanuts, absolutely fine in my salad for lunch. But if you're sitting at your desk working and you're snacking on nuts all the time and convincing yourself that there's no carbohydrates and these macadamia nuts are healthy, no, they're not. Those are calories that you're consuming for your head. That's a snack. The goal is to find some sugar-free clear fluid that you use as a bridge against emotional or head hunger, and you establish a ritual of consuming it about every 20 to 30 days, 20 to 30 minutes. And the list of sugar-free fluids is written down over here. I don't care if you use artificial sweeteners. It's a hell of a lot better for a heroin addict to stop using heroin, and if they need methadone, that's okay. Even though methadone is still an opioid, it helps them to get off the heroin. If I'm drinking a Fresca or a Diet Coke instead of a real Coke, I'm totally fine with that. Now, if all you drink is water, don't start drinking Diet Coke. But I have no problem with artificial sweeteners. However, if artificial sweeteners are a gateway drug, from an emotional perspective, stay away from them. But if you use artificial sweeteners, if you can drink unsweet tea with some Splenda in it, or if you can use the artificial sweeteners as a segue, as a bridge away from eating the real thing, eating real sugar, absolutely fine, knock yourself out. I do not have an issue with that, and I will defend that to my dying day, because I don't drink water. Okay?
Yeah. And,
very rarely. Yeah.
Just to cut in there, Gary Taubes's book, The Case Against Sugar, I think, in my opinion, the most fascinating chapter in that whole thing is where he addresses this whole thing about artificial sweeteners and stuff. And it's really, really interesting, you know, that everybody's saying you shouldn't eat these artificial sweeteners because they're so bad for you. But if you read what Gary's research, that almost all that scaremongering has its roots in the sugar industry, and that from what he showed, it was all bogus anyway. So
I agree absolutely
science,
with you.
the real science does not show, or there is no evidence that shows that stuff's going to give you cancer or all these other terrible things that people say that these things are going to do. So anyway,
right. And the risk of eating real sugar is so much greater that if you use the artificial sweeteners as a way away from real sugar, that's the benefit. Now, what I've had some people do is add 5 cups of Splenda to a bottle of unsweet tea. That's also not a good way to go, but a little bit is absolutely fine. So but it is possible. It's not possible for a fat or a diabetic person to maintain moderation. It is possible to maintain moderation when it comes to the sugar-free fluids. So, for example, using Crystal Light instead of lemonade in your vodka. So you get a vodka soda and you add a bit of Crystal Light. That's a hell of a lot better than drinking a lemonade-flavored margarita. So we do discuss alcohol. Alcohol is fine, but needs tight boundaries. Remember, you're vulnerable to addictive behavior, so don't use sugary mixes. But that's where you can use some of the artificial sweetener, sugary flavors. You can use sugar-free Jell-O. You can use things like that as a bridge if you have to have something after a meal or before you go to bed. So what we want to do is make this a practical rather than a theoretical way to go. And if you're eating that way, you're in good shape. Let me get back up to the top here. There's one other critical concept, and that is salt. Human beings have chased salt as a critical commodity our entire existence as a species. The human body is designed to use salt to manage fluid volume and blood pressure. Salt will not cause harm except in the face of sugar. So the way that salt works is salt retains fluid, and all the systems that regulate blood pressure regulate it through the regulation of salt. The renin-aldosterone system, which comes from the kidneys and the lungs, regulates salt metabolism. The kidney switches on the loss of salt or the retention of salt. So the way the kidneys work, you do not pee water. You pee salt, and the water chases the salt. When you sweat, you don't sweat water. You sweat salt, and the water goes with the salt. So salt is critical to the management of blood pressure and blood volume. It is only in the carbohydrate era where sugar retains water. That's why sugar dissolves in water, where sugar retains water, but the human body has no capacity to deal with a flood or the excess amount of water that's required when you eat sugar. When you come off sugar, you can radically reduce your water consumption and still be adequately hydrated, as long as your salt levels are high. And a large part of the big focus now amongst the keto people is, oh, your magnesium levels are low, or your potassium levels are low. Absolutely, that occurs. But you know why that occurs? That occurs secondarily to the fact that you don't have enough salt on board. So what your body does is it conserves the sodium, and you pee out the potassium and the magnesium, and you hold on to the sodium. If your sodium levels are adequate, and your body can deal with a massive amount of salt, if your salt levels are adequate, your magnesium, your potassium, your calcium levels will be adequate because they occur in the food that we eat, particularly when you're eating the meats. So don't worry so much about calcium, potassium, and magnesium at first. Worry about your salt. And only when you've got adequate sodium on board and your body is adequately managing salt, only then worry about magnesium or the other electrolytes. I don't worry about them at all. I'll monitor them, but I don't worry about them. The other concept is this whole thing about how much water we should drink.
Rob,
okay.
can I?
Yes.
Interesting when we talk about make sure you've got enough salt, but
yes.
For people that are listening, what do you define as sufficient salt?
Okay.
How much
very good question. Yeah, very good question. I don't have a specific gram number because, again, that's impractical. Nobody's going to weigh that out.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's gone away from our tables in restaurants, the two things that have gone away from when I was growing up, you very seldom see an ashtray on a table in America, and you never see a salt shaker on a table anymore. I have a salt shaker on my table at all times, and if I'm in a restaurant, I ask them to bring salt. I like the pink Himalayan salt. You know why I like the pink Himalayan salt, Greg? At least Doug? Because it's sexy. It looks pretty. In other words, there's no science behind it. Any salt is fine. Possibly the potassium-based salts are a little bit better, but if you can eat sodium chloride of any sort, it's absolutely fine. And the way I work is when whatever I'm eating, whether it's a salad, whether it's an egg, whether it's meat, I sit there and I grind the salt, and I've become accustomed to consuming salt. So it's 3 or 4 twists of that big salt shaker. I just add salt continuously. It's not the amount you eat with any meal, it's eating it with every meal.
Just eating it all the time, yeah.
Correct. And your body will always accommodate to excess. Unless you've got renal damage, and very few people have horrible renal damage, your body will be able to pee out or sweat out the excess salt. So don't worry about taking too much in. As long as you're eating salt without sugar, your blood pressure, your heart rate, everything else will be absolutely fine. So don't worry about the scare of your blood pressure, your heart rate. That never happened because of salt. It happened because of sugar. And we actually need salt so that we don't swell up. If you don't have enough salt in your body, in your bloodstream, then the fluid leaches out into your tissues, and your ankles swell up, and your body swells up. The tissue goes into the water goes into the soft tissues. When you've got salt, it retains it in your bloodstream, and when it reaches the kidney, you pee it out, and the kidney's job is to regulate that volume. The second thing that goes along with salt, and this is a critically important thing, this whole concept of hydration, hydration, hydration. Well, if it was important to drink 8 glasses of water a day or consume 64 ounces of water a day, as the recommendations are from the nouveau dietitians, then we as a species would be extinct. Because you know this, Doug, you're from the same part of the world as I am. The majority of sub-Saharan Africa just doesn't have that amount of water. So if it was essential and we came from that part of the world, we would not have had enough water to survive as a species. So clearly we don't need to consume that amount of water. However, sugar requires a huge amount of water to burn. Every molecule of sugar requires a molecule of water. Fat doesn't like water. So if you're burning fat, you don't need a huge amount of water. So I tell my patients to eat salt and drink when you're thirsty. Sip water. And I'm probably if I'm not being physically active, I'm in the 16 to 20 ounces a day, maybe a little bit more than that per day, because my water is not there to ebb and flow as my sugar levels go up and down. My water is there to eliminate waste. So water is a liquid waste disposal through my kidneys and through my sweat, maybe excess salt and that kind of thing. It is not there to pee out masses of clear fluid, bright, at least watery colored urine. In fact, if you look at the animal kingdom, all animals, including healthy dogs, pee very dark urine, because they don't drink a huge amount of water. They drink enough water, and that dark color are all the solutes that they're peeing out. But you don't need this pale, watercolored, watery urine. Your urine is okay being a little bit darker. And when it's too dark, your body will drive you to drink. So drink when you're thirsty and add salt to your food. And if I keep it that vague, you're going to be absolutely fine, because it's a massive ballpark. But don't force yourself to drink the 64 ounces or whatever else it is that they're obsessing about us drinking. That is unnecessary for someone in ketosis or on a low-carb, high-fat diet. So we've got to change our way of thinking about these recommendations. As a species, we've never pushed water. We've never pushed salt. They've always been available. We've taken what we needed. Does that make sense to you?
It does,
so
yeah.
you notice that I try not to use numbers at all when I'm categorizing what you should eat. The only number I use is that 30 grams of carbohydrates, staying well below that. Other than that, I really don't pitch numbers, because I don't want people to treat this as a diet. I want people to treat this as a way of life. And if part of your routine is to always ask for salt when you're in a restaurant and always have salt on your table, you're absolutely fine.
Yeah.
The two things that I have on my table at any one time, you can walk into my house anytime, you'll see these on my eating tables: salt and olive oil, because I add them liberally to my food.
Pam carries a salt cellar in her bag all the time, so whenever we guess at friends' houses or at a restaurant or whatever, she's always got salt available.
Absolutely perfect. Absolutely perfect. And whether it's vegetable material or meat material that you're eating, it's absolutely fine to do that. One final thing, a couple of final little points. If you're trying to lose weight or get rid of diabetes, never drink your calories. Never drink your calories if you can possibly help it. So things like soups and that kind of thing, try to stay away from them for 2 reasons. And this is people trying to lose weight or get rid of diabetes. The first thing is you can consume way more calories in the form of soup before you begin to feel full. The second thing is most liquid calories are carbohydrate based. So when you're drinking smoothies, when you're drinking juices, even the soups are primarily carbohydrate based. And we want you to stay the hell away from the carbohydrates. It's fine to put, let's say, chicken in a crock pot and boil it down and freeze some of that fat and add it to your vegetables down the road or whatever it may be. But that mush at the bottom should be fairly thick, almost like a stew, rather than making a soup. From time to time, a soup is fine if that's what you love to eat or drink, but make sure there's no carbohydrates in there. They love to add grains. They love to add pasta. They love to add potatoes. They love to thicken it with flour. Try to avoid the soups. Try not to drink your calories. So my rule is if it runs through a fork, it's not okay to consume. And absolutely, smoothies and juices and that kind of thing, stay the hell away from them. Because that is an issue. If you're going to drink coffee, add a little bit of milk, of whole milk or cream to your coffee if you wish to. But don't make a huge amount of milk and a tiny amount of coffee, because that, again, is calories for your head, and calories is a drink. I want you to separate out hydration, which is typically calorie-free fluids, from a meal, which is calorie-containing food. And if you make that separation, you're going to be in good shape. And then the final piece is it's okay to have vegetarian days, and it's okay to have carnivore days. You don't always have to eat a mixture of vegetables and meat on your plate. That is a new concept that occurred in the 60s and 70s along with the food pyramid, where they started going to portions of different things. So, you know, in the old days when we used to kill mammoths, we didn't say, oh, no, wait on the mammoth, let me go dig up some roots so we can eat that with our mammoth. No, we ate mammoth until it was gone, and then we went back to the vegetables as substance. So the goal there, if you want to eat mixed meals, that's fine, but it's absolutely fine just to have a steak, just to have a bowl of vegetables if you're going to throw some butter or some fat in there. And it's absolutely fine to do it that way. And in fact, and I know that the animal keto people are going to be, sometimes being a fortified vegetarian reduces your overall caloric consumption and gets you back on track after you've had a slip. So, because remember, excess protein is going to be turned to sugar. So one of the things I do when people have screwed up and made a mistake and fallen off the wagon a little bit, I try to get them to eat a high-fat vegetarian meal for a couple of days to get back on track, to get back into ketosis. So for example, if you eat that bowl of vegetables and you throw a stick of butter in there, not a huge amount of protein. If you eat a salad with cheese and olive oil and maybe a little bit of egg yolk in there, you're fat fortifying without the high protein, and you get back into ketosis a little bit quicker, and that's measurable on keto sticks. So there are some advantages to having the occasional vegetarian day. If you're a pure carnivore, that's fine too, but it's absolutely fine to mix back and forth from vegetarian and carnivore meals. So if you eat according to those strategies, and you'll see in that middle section where it says over here how to eat, it says planning 1 to 2 meals a day, breakfast is the least important meal of the day, no snacking, use bridges. The definition of a meal is sitting down with a plate of food and a knife and fork. Those are all strategies that you can use to get back to a nutritional form of eating. And then the next discussion that we'll have will be, okay, how do I fill the emotion management void? How do I return to eating nutritionally, which we've discussed today? And then how do I manage my emotional needs, my stress, my anxiety, my depression, and also my mental relaxation every 20 to 30 minutes. Now, having said all of that, I've spoken for too long. All of our brains need a rest, so I'm going to leave it alone over there. Thanks very much.
Okay, cool. So one of the things you were talking about was you would use up the glycogen and then your body would go into ketosis. So are you saying that if you were to measure your ketones before that happened, they would actually be really low, or would you just have ketones available, but you would be just using the glycogen as a preferable
right?
source?
So remember, remember that your ketones can come from two sources. They can come from your own fat cells, or they can come from the fat that you've eaten. So if you eat a very high fat diet, your ketones in your bloodstream will still be elevated, but your liver will not go to your fat cells to get extra fat as long as there's glycogen in the liver. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So when you've eaten a fat meal or you've eaten a sugar meal, the liver will respect that and allow that energy in the bloodstream to be used first.
Okay.
When the fat when your blood sugar comes down to a basal level if you're insulin sensitive, and the ketones disappear from your bloodstream. They may be at a trace level, but they're not going to be at the 2,3 plus level. Then your liver actually uses the glycogen to support your blood sugar. And once the glycogen is gone, then it goes to your fat cells and uses fat and mobilizes fat. So there is this continuous ebb and flow, even in people that are in ketosis. Their levels of fat utilization still fluctuates based on a meal. And what the liver will always do, even if you eat a very high fat meal, any protein in that meal will be converted to store glycogen. So one of the reasons I said that you want to eat a vegetarian meal that is high in fat is you want to radically, artificially reduce the amount of protein in that meal. It's a super low protein meal when you're trying to get rid of the glycogen in your liver so that the liver
get back into ketosis.
Correct. It gets you back into ketosis much quicker. Okay. But any protein that you eat, the liver will save a little bit of that as glycogen and then use that between meals. Because remember this, there's a biological advantage to maintaining fat stores and to accumulating a little bit of fat, because you never know when there's going to be a lean time. So the liver preferentially puts pressure on you to eat. And in times when you didn't have adequate food, then that was a survival technique. But now in the realm of abundance, the liver still puts that pressure on, and we eat excessively, especially if the drive is carbohydrates. So that's the rationale behind that. And what you're trying to do is to fool your liver into kind of a starvation mode, so it's forced to tap into your fat cells. But the liver is most protective of the fat, so it's actually quite difficult to initiate weight loss.
Yeah.
At least fat loss. You can initiate water loss very quickly, but not fat loss.
You were talking about gluconeogenesis earlier as well, and that was something else that I learned quite recently, was the fact that it can use fats as well in terms of, like, so you break down the triglycerides to start utilizing those fatty acids, and there's a glycerol backbone left.
Correct.
And it can actually utilize that for that gluconeogenesis process to create glucose in the bloodstream if it really needs it too.
Absolutely. So every fatty acid has 3 fatty acids connected by glycerol. And it's that glycerol that enters something called the Krebs cycle, and it becomes something called acetyl-CoA. Now, amino acids, when they get broken down, also form acetyl-CoA. So there's this intersection of carbohydrates, of fat, and of protein that all enter something called the Krebs cycle, and they could all be transferred across to each other. However, so most fat and most protein can be rebuilt in the human body. But there are 6 amino acids that are called essential amino acids that cannot be produced in the human body. And those are structural proteins. So those aren't energy proteins. There are certain what we call essential fatty acids that the human body cannot manufacture. We have to eat those. There are no essential carbohydrates. So the Krebs cycle is used for energy management. But remember, both fat and protein also have a micro use. Carbohydrates have 0 micro use. And that's what people don't understand. If you never ate a carbohydrate again, you can either use fat or protein to produce blood sugar. But you can't use carbohydrates to build cells, the fatty membranes around cells. You can use sugar to produce 14 of the 20 amino acids, but you cannot use sugar to produce the final 6.
The 6 essential ones, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So, and you don't get those essential ones in high quantities in vegetable proteins. And that's why the people that say, well, there's this amount of protein in beans, there's this amount of protein in a steak, it doesn't matter which you eat. That's bullshit, because it's not about the amount of protein, it's the type of amino acids. There's very little glutamine, for example, in beans. There's a ton of glutamine in food that we eat, in meat that we eat. So that's where the bullshit comes from, these plant-based people that try to fool us with a macro as a macro. No, they're not. And Zoe Harcum is excellent at defining that. So she's really, really good. And the other, this whole extractability of, well, vegetables have 20 grams of carbohydrates. Why can't I eat 20 grams of bread? Because you poop this out, you absorb all the carbohydrates in the bread. Because it's bioabsorbable.
So just tell us quickly what we're talking about next time.
So the part B of this is, particularly for the diabetics, is I want to take carbohydrates on a journey through the human body and explain how they do damage. If you look at my talk that I gave in San Diego, we talk about the blood vessels and all that kind of thing. That is because, why should I give up carbohydrates? Okay, it might make me a little bit fat, but I'm diabetic. I can reduce that to... what I want them to understand is what diabetes is. Because if you're going to get away from lipid heart and work on CMOD, I want them to understand what damage carbohydrates cause in the blood vascular system. And the two things we're going to focus on is inflammation and vascular injury. Vascular injury causes an ischemic effect that is diabetes, and inflammation is what cancers and all those kind of things are about.
Right.
So those are the two things we're going to focus on. And the diabetes is directly attributed to sugar. The cancers and the inflammations are actually come from oxidants that occur in polyunsaturated fat. And I want to explain, and when carbohydrates can get converted to fat, they form PUFAs, polyunsaturated fats, which are harmful toxic fats, pro-inflammatory fats. And then we'll talk a little about gluten as well. So we're going to talk about what aspects of a high carbohydrate diet cause harm and what the mechanism of harm is. So that's part B. And it just really gives some of the more scientifically minded people the incentive to stay the hell away from carbohydrates. Because people will tell me, when they stop eating carbohydrates, their joints get better, they're feeling better, their sleep apnea goes away, even before they lose a lot of weight. Those illnesses get better, and I want to explain why they get better and the advantages of fairly rapidly coming off carbohydrates. Okay. And then the next talk after that will be, and I went into a lot more depth with this talk than I usually do with most of my patients. So I usually combine part A and part B in the same talk.
Right.
But today I wanted to do this. Okay. And then
that's good. There was a lot of really good info there.
Yeah. Then the next talk is going to be, okay, why me? The emotional management side of things. Why did this happen to me? And what is the additional part that I need to work on to build up a diverse repertoire of emotion management systems and strategies? Okay. So that's the next big talk that we'll give. The next one will be a little bit shorter, but it's the biochemistry and the biology of, and I keep it very simple, but the biology of why sugar is bad and why healthy fat is good, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does, totally. That's awesome. And forward to the next one.